7 disturbing businesses that existed in the Middle Ages. Imagine a job so foul it was legally banished from city limits, or a profession where your daily commute involved wading through rivers of human waste. This wasn't the plot of a horror story. This was just another Tuesday in the Middle Ages. Life back then was a brutal fight for survival, forcing people into roles so gruesome and dangerous, it's hard for us to even wrap our heads around. Forget the fairy tale castles and knights in shining armor. The reality for most was lived in the grime, surrounded by disease and despair. Today, we're digging up the 7 most disturbing businesses people took on just to stay alive. Number 7, the tanner. Kicking things off at number 7, we have the tanner. Leather was basically the lifeblood of the medieval world. It was the Kevlar, the rubber, and the canvas of its time, used for everything from a soldier's armor and a farmer's shoes to the very books that monks spent a lifetime writing. But the process of turning a raw, rotting animal hide into something useful was one of the most stomach-churning jobs of the entire era. It all started with raw animal skins, which tanners got from butchers, or sometimes even scavenged from battlefields. These hides were crawling with bacteria and had to be treated fast. First step, getting rid of the hair and any leftover bits of flesh. And how did they do that? By soaking the hides for days in giant vats filled with a horrifying slurry. The key ingredient was often stale urine, which was so crucial to the process that towns had communal pots just to collect it for the local tannery. Workers would then stomp on the hides, barefoot, for hours to work the foul mixture in. But it gets worse. To soften the hide, a process called baiting was next. This meant pounding the hides with animal dung. Dog and pigeon droppings were favorites, and letting the bacteria in the excrement break the leather down for weeks or even months. The stench of ammonia, sulfur, and decay was so overpowering that tanneries were legally forced to operate downstream and downwind of towns, creating their own rancid districts on the edge of society. Chronic exposure to these toxic, decaying materials led to constant sickness and made tanners social outcasts, feared by the very people who relied on their work. Number 6, the tooth drawer. Next up, at number 6, is the tooth drawer, the medieval world's terrifying version of a dentist. In an age with zero concept of hygiene, tooth decay was everywhere, and a bad toothache could be a life-threatening agony. When the pain got to be too much, your only real option was a visit to one of these guys, but don't picture an office. The tooth drawer worked in the middle of a crowded public market, turning your private misery into public entertainment. These practitioners weren't trained physicians. Most of the time, they were barbers who were used to handling razors, or even blacksmiths whose main qualification was just brute strength. Anesthesia? Forget about it. You, the patient, would sit on a stool while the tooth drawer went at you with a horrifying set of tools. The most common was a dental pelican, a crude metal contraption that used your own jaw for leverage to rip the tooth out. It was brutally effective, but often caused serious collateral damage, like breaking other teeth or even fracturing the jawbone. The whole ordeal was so notoriously painful and the practitioners so untrustworthy that it inspired a common medieval French expression to lie like a tooth drawer. If they didn't get the tooth on the first try, they just went at it again and again, inflicting unbelievable pain. And since sterilization wasn't a thing, infections were incredibly common. A simple tooth extraction could easily spiral into a fatal case of sepsis. You might get relief from one pain, only to invite a much deadlier one. Number 5, the leech collector. Coming in at number 5 is a job that sounds more like a monster from a fantasy novel than a real profession: the leech collector. Medieval medicine was all about the theory of the 4 humors, which said that sickness came from an imbalance of fluids in the body. So, the go-to treatment for almost everything, from a headache to the plague, was bloodletting, and the preferred tool for that was the medicinal leech. But where did doctors get all these leeches? They didn't just magically appear. They had to be harvested from the wild, and that's where the leech collector came in. This job usually fell to the poorest of the poor, often elderly women. The method was as simple as it was sickening. They'd wade into stagnant, murky ponds and marshes and use their own bare legs as bait. They would stand there in the cold water, perfectly still, as the blood-sucking creatures latched onto their skin. Once enough leeches had gorged themselves on blood, the collector would peel them off one by one and pop them in a jar to sell to doctors. The risks were huge. A collector could lose a dangerous amount of blood, which could cause them to get dizzy and faint while standing in deep water. On top of that, the leech bites often got infected, and the filthy water they waded through was a breeding ground for all kinds of diseases. It was a painful, hazardous, and low-paying job that literally required you to offer up your own blood to make a living. Number 4, the rat catcher. At number 4, we have a job born from the desperation of Europe's darkest hour, the rat catcher. During the Black Death and other plague outbreaks, cities were completely overrun with rats. While people didn't yet understand that fleas on the rats were spreading the disease, they knew the vermin were a sign of sickness and filth. The rat catcher's job was to go into the most infested parts of the city, filthy alleys, sewers, and plague-ridden homes, and try to get the population under control. Armed with basic traps, trained dogs, or sometimes just a big stick, the rat catcher was on the front lines of a war they couldn't possibly win. The work was incredibly dangerous. They were constantly at risk of being bitten, and a bite from an infected rat could lead to a fatal illness. In a grim twist of irony, the very people hired to stop the spread of disease were often blamed for it, as their presence became associated with the plague itself. They moved through the city like ghosts, a necessary evil no one wanted to look at. This job put them in a direct daily battle with the source of the plague. Every dead rat they handled, every flea-infested hovel they stepped into, was a massive gamble with their own life. They were society's exterminators, fighting an invisible enemy with their bare hands, and they were often among the first to die from the very pestilence they were trying to contain. Number 3, the executioner. Next, at number 3, we have a profession that was both a vital part of the law and a source of total social disgust: the executioner. In the medieval world, justice was public theater, and the executioner was the star of the show. Their duties went way beyond just hangings. Depending on the crime, they might be required to perform beheadings, burnings at the stake, or the gruesome punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't a job for just anyone. A botched execution was seen as not only cruel, but a professional failure that could start a riot. The executioner needed a steady hand, a strong stomach, and a solid understanding of human anatomy. Their work didn't end at the gallows either. They were often tasked with torturing prisoners for information and getting rid of the bodies afterward. Despite being essential for law and order, executioners were complete social outcasts. They were often forced to live on the very edge of town, and their trade was so hated that it was often passed down through families, since no one else would marry them. To make extra money, they often took on other unclean jobs, like getting rid of animal carcasses, cleaning latrines, or even taxing lepers and prostitutes. They were the living embodiment of the state's power, yet they were feared and shunned, living isolated lives as the grim keepers of justice. Number 2, the body collector. Coming in at the number 2 spot is a job that is almost too horrifying to imagine: the body collector, or plague barrier. When the Black Death tore across Europe, it left a tidal wave of death, killing up to 60% of the population in some places. Cities turned into massive tombs with corpses piling up in the streets and inside houses. It was the body collector's grim duty to clear them away. These workers, sometimes called becchini in Italy, would pull dead carts through the streets, ringing a bell and shouting the now famous phrase, "Bring out your dead." Terrified families, often quarantined inside with the sick, would lower the bodies of their relatives down from windows, sometimes using long poles with hooks to keep their distance. The sights and smells were apocalyptic. Plague victims were covered in grotesque sores that sometimes burst, and the stench of decay was everywhere. The collectors would haul the bodies to mass graves, huge pits dug outside the city walls. One Florentine writer described the process with a chillingly casual comparison, saying the bodies were layered with dirt, just as one makes lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese. This was one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. With almost no protection, their constant contact with highly infectious corpses meant that many body collectors soon ended up in their own carts. They were also widely hated, sometimes extorting money from grieving families just to take a body away. They were the sanitation workers of the apocalypse, walking through death every single day. Number 1, the gong farmer. And finally, at number 1, we have the most foul, unsanitary, and socially hated business of the Middle Ages, the gong farmer. Long before modern sewers, human waste from latrines and cesspits had to be removed by hand. This was the job of the gong farmer. The term gong came from an Old English word for to go, and these workers were, quite literally, farmers of human poop. This was not a job for the faint of heart. Gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., so the public would be spared the horrific sight and smell. Their work involved climbing down into cesspits, sometimes up to their necks in years of accumulated filth, and scooping the solidified human excrement, known as night soil, into buckets. These buckets were then hauled up by assistants and carted outside the city walls to be used as fertilizer. The dangers were extreme. The toxic fumes from the waste could knock you out from asphyxiation, and there are recorded cases of gong farmers drowning after slipping and falling into the muck. They were completely shunned by society, forced to live in designated areas away from everyone else. And yet, despite the unimaginable conditions, the job was absolutely essential. Without them, cities would have quickly drowned in their own waste, and disease would have been even worse. For performing the single most disgusting yet necessary job imaginable, the gong farmer is the undisputed champion of disturbing medieval businesses. Conclusion. From the stench of the tannery to the terror of the plague pits, the medieval world was built on the backs of people who did the unthinkable to survive. These 7 businesses, as gruesome as they are, were the gears that kept society from grinding to a halt. They're a stark reminder that for every king on a throne, there were thousands of ordinary people just trying to make it to the next day in a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. So, what do you think? Which of these jobs would you least want to have? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you found this trip to the grimy side of history fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Thanks for watching.